Hello and welcome back to Dwarf Studios. I'm recording this episode ahead of time, so this is going to sound a little bit strange, but by the time you hear this episode, because if you're my Patreon you'll see this straight away, and for the rest of you, well, this video will come out on the correct date. It will be my birthday! Yay me! A little bit older, a little bit greyer, and hopefully get longer in the beard at the very least. So, because today is my birthday, I've decided that I'm going to talk about something that you may have seen pop into an occasional video or two. My love of Bretonnia, the Warhammer Fantasy faction from the old world. I love this faction so much. And it's for many reasons. Despite the fact that they didn't give an awful lot of love, especially in the end times, the Bretonnians remain my favourite because of the setting they're in, and because of the juxtaposed position that Bretonnia has. You've got your Arthurian, English-French noble knights who are going around looking for the Grail, who are meant to be honourable, chivalrous and noble people, and they're riding past on their glorious steeds through the towns of, well, decrepit, malformed, inbred and very underappreciated peasants. And frankly, I've often known games where I've played with my Bretonnians where the peasants are actually the thing that carries the day, and the Bretonnian knights are the ones that are the cowardly failures on many occasions. It's very funny, but I think it's that juxtaposition that I find so amusing. And on top of that, it fits so well in Warhammer Fantasy, because normally a faction like this wouldn't work. Warhammer Fantasy is not as grimdark as 40k, but it is a world where everything is slowly getting worse. You've got chaos slowly encroaching, you've got the Skaven, you've got orcs, you've got the undead, all these factions that are trying to undermine everyone. And you'd think a faction based on the ideas of nobility, chivalry, being an honourable, upright person, and just, having that kind of optimism wouldn't really make any sense. But we've seen it kind of work with the Tau, and it's a similar kind of setup, I suppose. But as it's my birthday, I'm going to talk about Bretonnia, and hopefully you'll enjoy this video. And so I guess we better start at the beginning. Way back, during the times of Sigmar, when he was wandering around being a mortal boy, the Bretonii decided nuts to all the greenskins and goblins, and wandered across the Grey Mountains. Ended up in the land that became known forever after as Bretonnia. The people who came across into this land noticed there were an awful lot of very elegant buildings and castles that were more or less abandoned. This is because, many years before, this used to belong to the High Elves, who had to retreat because the Dwarves kicked their ass. Go Dwarves. In any case, the Bretonnians found these places, quite agreeable to them, and they decided that they would occupy the settlements that they found and build new ones. They also specialised in a form of warfare where they were on horseback. Essentially, heavy cavalry tactics. First starting off with spears in their ancient days, but then progressing to lances. Because lances are awesome, and they do all kinds of horrendous damage. So anyway, time goes by, and the Bretonii have set themselves up in various areas around the lands that become known as Bretonnia, but they were really struggling because there were orcs and goblins and Skaven, beastmen and chaos marauders that were rampaging up and down their countryside. And it seemed at one point, particularly from the orcs, that the Bretonii might get squashed before they even become a solid nation. If it were not for Giles le Breton, the saviour of Bretonnia, the warrior king, and basically the coolest dude who ever cooled being a cool dude. He decided nuts to this, and he rode out with his trusty companions and started laying waste to everything left, right and centre, in many of the great battles of Giles le Breton. I still very fondly hold on to my Bretonnian army book. Despite selling all my Bretonnian models, I could not part from this thing, because the artwork in it is beautiful, and I'm going to be showing some of it here, and it just is full of fantastic, beautiful stories and lore, and I just love it. It's great. And I'm also a very big fan of Anthony Reynolds' Knights of Bretonnia series. 3 books that follow a particular knight going through the various stages of Errant, Knight of the Realm, Questing Knight, and finally Grail Knight of the Realm. A really enjoyable set of books, and I highly recommend you get them if you have any interest in Bretonnia, or if you just like knights going around killing things. and being awesome whilst doing it, with a bit of interesting intrigue going on in the background. But you'll understand once you've read the book. In any case, back to Giles le Breton. He got together with two of his best friends, Dwarf of Lyonesse and Landuin of Mousillon. After cleansing the lands that belonged to Giles le Breton, the now Duchy of Baston, they were going to go forth and cleanse all of Bretonnia. But before a battle where it looked like all hope was lost, Giles le Breton came upon a vision. The Lady of the Lake. This goddess gave Giles le Breton a chance to save his people, under the condition that from this point onwards, the nobility of the Bretonii would worship her as their god. There are some other gods the Bretonians worship, however, the Lady of the Lake is by far the biggest deity in Bretonnia. Only the nobles get to worship her though, she's not all that keen on peasants either. But I'll explain that later on. And allowed him to drink from the Grail. This imbued him with superhuman strength, speed, agility, and, well, basically Giles le Breton had God mode on now, and this drink was given to every Grail companion forever after, and is where the Grail Knights come from, although they aren't quite as powerful as Giles le Breton and his original buddies were. So once they drank this Grail, they just started laying waste to everything in sight. And to make matters more fun, every lord that they recruit into their army gets a chance to drink from the Grail, if he proves worthy. These lords became known as the Companions of the Grail, and the reconquering of Bretonnia was done in 12 great battles, each one more ridiculous and incredible than the last. Lord Marcus of Bourdeleu, Lord Fredmond of Aquitaine, Lord Balduin of Brionne, Lord Lambard of Carcassonne, Lord Raymond the Pure of Quenles, Lord Algegar of Paravon, Lord Matard of Montfort, Lord Beren of Griot, and Lord Fulgar of Artois. Eventually, the entire lands of Bretonnia are finally reconquered, the orcs, beastmen, and goblins, chaos marauders are driven out, and the land of Bretonnia is founded. However, Giles le Breton didn't get to see it for very long. In a battle with the orcs and goblins, he was felled by an arrow, which I've always found a little strange, like the guy was more or less a demigod at this point. Heck, in one particular battle, Giles le Breton was equally shot in the chest by what is described as a mighty bolt sent by an infernal device, which could mean anything from a goblin dude diver just smashed himself into Giles le Breton's chest, unlikely, or a ballista, or an arrow. One of those anyway. However, this only seemed to knock him down for the night, because the next morning he opened his eyes, grasped the arrow with both hands and yanked it out of his chest, and then went forth to kill the bejesus out of even more goblins. So, you know, this is why I have issue believing that a single arrow could do something to Giles le Breton at this point, and he got killed by an arrow from a random orc. But hey ho, this is a mythological story more than anything else, so, you know, something has to kill him. And this is where the Bretonians' disdain for all kinds of ranged weapons come from. Only peasants and Bretonians out hunting ever used ranged weapons, unless it's a trebuchet, but even then, you've got to convince people to come out of their castle, so, you know, just tell the peasants to mount a trebuchet and throw stones at the walls until people come out and fight on the battlefield like truly noble people should. But his companions found a boat that they felt for some reason was the best place to put Giles, placed him in it, and his body was taken away into the afterlife, where the Fey Enchantress told his companions that when the time is most dire, Giles le Breton would come back and save his people. Which she did, in a manner of speaking, in the end times. But I'll get back to that later. With the death of Giles le Breton in what was known in the Imperial calendar, aka the Empire, as 995, or Year 17 as the Bretonians call it, Giles' only son Louis decided that the best thing for him to do was to become as awesome as his dad. So he decided to go and find the lady. And this was a good plan, because whether or not he was to be ruler or not was much hotly debated. A lot of people wanted Landuin of Mousillon to take up his position, as though Landuin of Mousillon was very much loved by the Bretonian people, and was seen as a paragon of chivalry and honour, his rival Dwarf of Lyonesse was an equally powerful man, or the wise Marquis of Bordelou, or the headstrong Lord Fulgar of Artois. But this could equally cause a civil war if not handled carefully enough, and it was decided that no lord could ever rule Bretonnia unless he had received the blessing of the lady. So Louis left the court, leaving his lance behind, and decided to take up what was now known as the questing vow, that he would never stay in one place for more than 2 nights, and always seek the Grail. In his absence, Therof of Lyonesse acted as the steward. It was years later that Louis came back, and no one had any doubts that he had found the lady, and been blessed by the Grail. And so it was that he was crowned King of Bretonnia, and set about creating the many laws and traditions that continue until this day. He formalised the code of honour and chivalry that the companions lived by, and many of these original vows still live on tapestries in the castle of Coron. All over Bretonnia, these knights embraced these vows with gusto, many of them trying to seek the Grail, many of them finding it, and many of them becoming powerful lords in their own right. Grail Knights are virtually immortal. They don't appear to age, they remain as strong as they were when they drank the Grail, and it is only death that will separate them from the mortal world. In this way, it was 50 years for the last Grail companion, Landuin of Mousillon, to die under mysterious circumstances in his homeland in Mousillon. However, despite the death of the legendary Grail companions, Bretonnia grew wealthy, and for hundreds of years Bretonnia just grew in strength and influence. They have a alliance, mostly alliance I want to say, with the Empire. There have been some skirmishes between the two, but nothing that's ever grown so serious as to break out into actual war. But on the whole, the Bretonnians and the Empire both share a common belief that mankind needs to stick together and fight alongside, even if the Bretonnians can't quite stand the guns and cannons of the Empire, and the Empire think that the Bretonnians are foppish, ridiculous nobles. I think I'm going to save a complete history of the Bretonnian people for a separate video someday, as I think it could take quite a long time to tell that story, and I wouldn't be able to tell it to the best of my ability in one go. But suffice to say, Bretonnia spends many hundreds of years waging war across the world, going on crusades to various places, and basically kicking all kinds of ass. But also their pride and arrogance often gets the best of them, resulting in them having rather embarrassing defeats. The Bretonnian army is very different from a standard military army, in that your cavalry are your main force. Heavy shock cavalry, the lightest of which being the Errant Knights. These are the young knights from various nobles who are going off to test their spurs, to win renown and to become a Knight of the Realm, which is only achievable through an errantry war, or through obtaining a great deed. Once they are a Knight of the Realm, they often become owners of land and property, or they're given a title, something suitably appropriate for their station, and most knights don't progress much further than this. But many, who feel the call from the Lady of the Lake, choose to become questing knights, in which case they give up all they possess except for their arms, weaponry and armour. They leave their lance behind and they take up a two-handed sword and go forth on a quest to find the Grail, doing awesome things as they go, and basically wandering for the rest of their lives. Depending upon what a questing knight feels is the right direction, this means that questing knights can be seen as far away as the jungles of Lustria, to the deserts of Araby, to the World's Edge Mountains, or into the Chaos Wastes. As far as a questing knight is concerned, wherever they feel the lady is taking them is the correct place to be, and they just have to kill or achieve whatever the objective is when they get there. Some never find the Lady of the Lake, and some of them never get to drink from the Grail. But those who do are considered some of the purest and most noble warriors amongst Bretonnian history, and Grail Knights are really terrifying cavalry. They have magical attacks, they know no fear at all, they had the special rule known as immune to psychology, which means they literally couldn't give the faintest of, well, you know what I mean. And they would go and fight and stomp on anything they came across. These guys were almost equal to blood knights, vampires. That's how fast and powerful these guys were. And your army was backed up by your peasants. your poor, foot-slogging, unfortunate, decrepit, malformed men-at-arms, a noble title for a rather unfortunate bunch, are basically given some light armour, basic training, if they are given any training at best, and told to stay in tight formations and essentially point the pointy thing at the enemy and stay where you are. In this way, peasants are usually used as bait or as a means to take the initial charge of the enemy, which allows the knights to then circle round the sides and, well, squash them, which 9 times out of 10 tends to work. The peasants are also the only people in your army who are allowed ranged weapons, in this case the longbow. Unlike the man-at-arms, who is given very basic training and really expected to stay there, take the charge and enjoy his lot in life, a peasant who is armed with a longbow is actually more likely not only to survive the battle, because, you know, they are well out of the way, but on top of that, they are actually trained. Bretonnian peasants who possess a bow train from more or less as soon as they can walk, because peasants know that if they can use a bow, they can work for their local lord, hunting food, you know, catching his game, that kind of stuff, and that potentially means they might get paid, or at the very least they might get some kind of recompense. You can live and hope, you know, which is a fantastic ranged unit, all things considered, and you get to have fire arrows, which is neat, and defensive stakes, which, whilst won't stop things for very long, it removes some of the charge bonuses and makes skirmishers less likely to come around and eat you. The next Bretonnian peasant unit I'm going to talk about isn't, technically speaking, a mainline battle unit. They just kind of, well, turn up when there's a questing knight or a grail knight around, usually a grail knight. Battle pilgrims. These guys are, well, if it was even possible to admit this, they're even more badly equipped than your standard man-at-arms. This is because your battle pilgrim basically he's a hoarder. A collectomaniac hoarder rolled into one. Basically, Grail Knights are viewed very much as religious saints, you know? So these pilgrims follow the Grail Knight around because they believe for one reason or another the lady has told them to, or they feel it is their mission to. They want to bask in some of his glory, as it were. And so, as the Grail Knight kind of, you know, goes on his adventures, inevitably some of his armour gets broken, you know, he might discard a shield that's bent, or a sword that's snapped, you know. This stuff, the battle pilgrims collect, and keep with them as religious trophies, and they will follow this unfortunate Grail Knight with a fanatical zeal, and do everything they possibly can to make his experience as relaxed as possible, doing their best not to get in his way, but at the same time being close enough that if he wanted them to do something, he could ask them, and they would basically consider it an honour. And this extends until death, because the battle pilgrims have this unique little thing called a Grail Reliquary. Yeah, that's what it... You're not hallucinating. They're carrying the skeleton of the Grail Knight's horse and the dead Grail Knight, and they will protect it with a zeal that is absolutely astonishing. Yeah, but despite the Grail Knight being dead, the Grail Reliquary emits a magical kind of protection, and allows the battle pilgrims to benefit from the blessing of the lady, which is interesting, and one of the many reasons that it proves how Warhammer Fantasy magic works. These pilgrims believe so fervently that they will gain the blessing of the lady by protecting this reliquary that it does. No other way to describe it, really. And these nutters will go wherever the Grail Knights go. And whilst I wouldn't necessarily use them as a mainline unit because, well, like I said, they are even more terrible than peasants, they are fanatical and will at least stay still and fight for as long as they can. And if there's a Grail Knight nearby, then they'll fight all the harder. And the last, and possibly the best that most peasants could ever even hope to ever achieve, is mounted yeomen. These peasants are allowed to ride horses, not Bretonnian war horses, because no Bretonnian noble would ever let a peasant ride one of their horses. Good God! No, they would cut the hand off a peasant who tried to mount one of their horses. No. These are just ponies. Just, common work ponies. Nothing too fancy. The yeomen are used to scout out the enemy position and report back to the knights. That is basically their job. Often they are armed with bows or spears. I've never personally used them because the models were so damn hard to get a hold of, even when GW were selling them, although they seemed to sell them in very small quantities and they were really expensive. But anyway, I never really got a chance to use them, but from what I had heard and seen, they're not a bad scout cavalry unit. Just don't expect them to do anything particularly heroic. And then you have the trebuchet, which is a wonderful piece of machinery invented by a peasant known for being an eccentric bastard child, and also a pious man who was fit to visions, decided to build the trebuchet in a single night, and it was used to fend off some northern raiders. The king was so impressed that not only did he pay him to copy the design and improve upon it, he also gave him a fatted pig and 2 copper crowns, which is more wealth than he could ever have hoped to have gained in his lifetime, which is really depressing when you think about it. And if you thought standard cavalry was fun, Bretonnians have 2 additional options. They have the Pegasus, a flying mount, which can deliver a lance into someone's unfortunate chest with far more strength and impact, or the Hippogriff, which unfortunately in the game is too expensive for its points, but it is still a very powerful mount in and of itself. Basically, it's a griffin of sorts. In fact, fun story, one of my favourite ways to play my Bretonnian army was what I loved to call the RAF. Basically, the majority of my army that could was on a Pegasus or a Hippogriff. Everything was flying. It basically made a mockery of battlefield formations, because I could just fly over the top of someone, position myself so that their entire army's in disarray, and then just charge willy-nilly. It was hilarious to play, and a nightmare for other people, especially as the Pegasus Knight was no slouch. Your Bretonnian army is always going to be led by a Bretonnian knight or lord. They will be escorted by paladins, who more often than not will carry the battle standard bearer, or at the very least they will be a paladin who will go out with the knights and kick various kinds of butt. And you will have damsels. Yeah, I haven't really explained yet the history on damsels, so I better squeeze this in here. A damsel, or a prophetess, are messengers of the Lady of the Lake and the Fey Enchantress, who is her representative on Earth. Damsels and prophetesses are the mages, the counsellors, advisors, and basically the religious leaders of the Bretonnian nation. You do not want to upset a damsel, because to offend a damsel you are offending the lady herself, and Bretonnians are very careful with women because of this. Damsels are the daughters of nobles who are taken at birth when it's discovered they have magical powers. Fey creatures come from the forest of Athalloran and take them in there, and if it's not a child taken during the night, then a damsel or a prophetess will come to your castle and demand that you hand over your children with magical potential. The boys are never seen again, and it's entirely possible that they are sacrificed. Yeah, I know this is the land of chivalry, but this is still Warhammer Fantasy. There's a dark twist in here all the time. And unfortunately, because of the logic of Warhammer Fantasy, that does make sense. The Lady of the Lake is proven to be an extraordinarily powerful deity, which is strange considering the number of her followers is much fewer than the Empire. And despite this, as at the beginning of every battle the Bretonnian army prays to the Lady for protection, she is able, and often, on a really irritating, for the Empire at least, regular basis, able to deflect cannonballs off knights' heads, and make arrows look positively pointless on their armour, even to the point of giving them sometimes magical attacks the ability to ignore fear and terror, and healing magics. Sigmar is proven to be equally powerful, but he has far more followers, whereas Bretonnia, you only get the nobles who worship the lady, at least that's the only people who are allowed to worship the lady. So how is the Lady of the Lake so powerful? Well, unfortunately, sacrifices are the only other thing that makes sense. These magically gifted children being sacrificed in her honour would help empower her. And as I said earlier, Giles the Breton had to promise that he would worship her till the rest of his days. And we don't know what else Giles the Breton promised in order for his kingdom to remain undestroyed by orcs. But the daughters of these nobles always come back as damsels prophetesses who go forth and essentially assist the various dukes in whatever it is they need to do, trained in various different laws in the types of magic. These damsels are more or less autonomous. They can go more or less where they want and say whatever they like, so long as it aligns with what the Fey Enchantress wants. There are even Bretonnian damsels who, well, we don't know if they can necessarily marry, but certainly intimate relationships with knights is not uncommon, and it certainly doesn't ever hurt their virtue either. Women in Bretonnian society have very much a secondary role, unless they are a damsel, or a queen or noble lady. If you're noble and you're female, you're okay so long as you obey the etiquette of the time. Whilst I would never say that women are repressed in Bretonnian society, I would certainly say that as soon as they leave the traditional roots for women in that society, things start to become a little complicated. There are no female knights, for example. That's just a no-no. Bretonnians don't do that at all. It completely contradicts their belief in their code of chivalry. So yeah. Sexist? Quite possibly. But this is just how the Bretonnians are and how they've acted for hundreds of years. Bretonnian knights and lords will allow the damsels and prophetesses to ride alongside their knights, and in fact one of the most important tactics that you should use when you play Bretonnians is putting your damsel into a lance unit. Basically, the damsel stays within the unit protecting the knights, whilst the knights can concentrate on killing everything in front of them. And this has the added bonus that the damsel can cast her spells with relative safety, and the knights will fight to the death to prevent her from becoming injured, meaning she's relatively safe and can dish out tons of damage, or just keep healing them, making them very durable. The Fey Enchantress is the representative of the Lady of the Lake on Earth, as I've just said. Her real name is Morgiana Le Fay. Yes, I know, lots of King Arthur ringing through here, but she is mostly a good person. Just don't upset her, because she has been known to turn wizards who insult her into a frog. Just for the lulz. Also rumoured to be the daughter of the Lady of the Lake herself. Who her daddy is? Well, that's explained in the end times. And I'm not a massive fan of the end times, if I'm honest. There are one or two good moments, but on the whole, I can't say I'm a fan. Anyway, it is her job to make sure that not only are the damsels and prophetesses towing the line, but the Bretonnian lords are too. She helps maintain the codes of chivalry and honour that not only help empower her goddess, but also make sure that the kingdom remains relatively stable. Now, how can I not talk about Bretonnia and not mention the Green Knight? A complete badass who jumps out from the mists or out from the forests with the cry, "None shall pass," and proceeds to lay waste to, well, anyone stupid enough to stand in the way. Often the Green Knight is the final test for the questing knight before they may drink from the Grail. And he is a beast. He's a boss. On the tabletop, he can appear from anywhere, charge out, and then just mincemeat characters. That's kind of what he was best at. In the lore, he's a fantastic, interesting entity. and you don't learn who he is until the very end. Spoilers, it's Giles Le Breton. I mean, who else was it going to be, really? With his dolorous blade and his shadow steed, he is a force to be reckoned with. Riding across the battlefield, being ethereal one moment and hard as steel the next, he is a brilliant combatant. And last, but by no means least, King Luin Leoncoeur, the current monarch of the lands of Bretonnia, and his capital is in Coron. This is a pretty cool dude. He is rumoured to have been the most noble Bretonnian to ever come out of that land. And considering Bretonnia, with its nobles and the ideals of chivalry they're meant to live up to, not necessarily what they actually managed to achieve, but the ideal they're trying to live up to, is really damn impressive. He has waged wars against the undead, against greenskins, beastmen, chaos, and he has defeated them all, on top of his trusty hippogriff, Beaky. It's spelt funny. I say Beaky, it's got a Q in there, so Biku? BQE? It's French, so, it's a little hard to pronounce. But anyway, I apologise to all speaking French people. But anyway, he's a pretty cool dude, and he is so pure that his blood hurts even demons. Yes, his blood is a weapon. That's how pure he is to those who are chaotic in nature. And he has ruled Bretonnia wisely for many, many, many years. And if it were not for the end times, he would still be ruling it. This is why there's a twinge of sadness. But I must not despair. Warhammer Fantasy is coming back, and it will be interesting to see what they do. So I think before I finish this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the contradiction that I love between the peasants and the nobles. The peasants have a vow that they have to recite every week. Essentially, they must give 9/10 of everything they produce, everything they create, to their lord. They must give everything to their knightly lord, and in doing so, their knights should protect them. This is often not the case, and often the knights look down on the peasants because of how, the despicable position that they're in. Because the peasant populations are so tightly controlled, and movement between the various towns is restricted or controlled, this means that inbreeding is inevitable, which means that the peasants grow more and more deformed, which means they become more, let's just say disabled. So, why do I really like this faction when I've talked so much about their nobility, but keep seeming to kind of joke about how horrible the peasant's position is? I think it's because I actually like the twist to the nobility that they're trying to act up to. These knights have basically been brought up to believe that they are noble, that they are these superhero-like beings who are going forth to vanquish evil, and, the world's very black and white, and the peasants are there to help them achieve their goals. But they don't really think of the peasants. There are a couple noble lords who are actually very generous and kind, and, they actually do encourage some growth amongst the peasants in the population, but partially because of the inbreeding, partially because of the lack of education, because peasants are often not even taught to read or write, it makes it difficult for the knights to empathise with their peasants. They just see them as filthy cattle sometimes, and I think it's the dark twist between someone who believes they are noble, but their actions don't show they're noble that I find interesting. Societies have often decided that if you are not me, you are other, and if you are other, that makes you less. And Bretonnians do that. Hidden behind this shiny veneer of nobility, there is a much darker, sinister aspect to them. Even Luan Leoncoeur, who is arguably the most noble Bretonnian king they've ever had, and wise enough to know when it's not worth starting a war over an insult, because yes, that has happened before. It nearly led to a war between the Empire and Bretonnia. This means that Bretonnia has a complicated moral compass, which kind of goes off in all different kinds of directions. If there's an obvious foe, then they will go straight through it, and they will kill it and be all righteous and say, yay, look what we've done. But when it comes to their peasantry, paying their peasants, for example, for a hard day's work, or allowing peasants to learn, progress, and move from town to town, then that becomes more complex, and they don't like it because it creates change. Bretonnians have outlawed guns. They don't use cannons. And like I said, the only artillery they have is the trebuchet. The only ranged weapon they have is the bow, and that's strictly for peasants, for war and for hunting. It is a culture that has refused to grow and change. And because of it, Bretonnia kind of reaches a point where it can't grow much further without something breaking. And I think that's something I would have enjoyed seeing if the story could have progressed in Warhammer Fantasy. Yes, it would have changed some aspects of Bretonnia, but it would be interesting to see how it changes. Do the knights become more ruthless and brutal? Does this cause civil wars? Does it mean that the Bretonnians wonder what they're fighting for? And on top of that, do the peasants decide to, revolt? Which would be complicated because peasants don't have any access to weapons, but you know what I mean. It asks interesting questions because these kinds of things have happened in the real world with quite disastrous consequences. Just look up French and British medieval history and you'll have a rough idea of what I mean. And when you throw things like magic and demons and monsters into the mix, that just makes the situation even more complicated and dangerous. It's only when ranged weapons start levelling the playing field, meaning that knights aren't quite as shiny and protected as they thought they were, that the modern soldier is no longer a knight, but a man with a gun. I hope you all really enjoyed this video. This is just my little song to Bretonnia, as it were, and I genuinely look forward to seeing them again in Warhammer Fantasy. And frankly, well, it will probably convince me to recollect those models, because if the game's playable again, I miss my cavalry charges, my peasants doing hilarious things, and my knights just being outshone by their horses. But in any case, I hope you're all having a fantastic day wherever you are, and I'm now going to go off and eat some birthday cake. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Take care.